Well, at the moment, I'm certainly looking again at the whole question of a recent African origin for modern humans, because that's been the leading idea of the last 20 years, that we had a recent African origin, that we came out of Africa and we replaced all these other humans that were outside of Africa. And we're having to reevaluate that now, because genetic data show that the modern humans who came out of Africa maybe 60,000 years ago actually interbred with Neanderthals, first of all, and then some of them later on interbred with another group of people called the Denisovans over in Eastern Asia. So we are not purely a recent African origin. We're mostly recent African origin, but there was contact with these other so-called species. So we're having to come and look at out of Africa again, and also even look at the species concepts we've got, because if these species are interbreeding with each other, are they really distinct species? So we've got to look again at the species question. And for me, we can show clearly that the Neanderthals were a distinct lineage. They had their own separate evolutionary history. So we're having to reevaluate the out of Africa theory, and we're going to have to reevaluate our species concepts, because on one view of thinking, species are self-contained units, they don't interbreed with other species. And for me, the whole idea of Neanderthals as a different species is really a recognition of their separate evolutionary history. The fact that we can show that they evolved through time in a particular direction, distinct from modern humans, and they separated maybe 400,000 years ago from our lineage. So they're in that position of being either a part of Homo sapiens, but a very different part to anyone alive today, or, as I prefer to argue, they're a separate species, a separate evolutionary history. But I've never actually argued that that meant they were reproductively isolated from us, because we know that many closely related species, in primates for example, bonobos and common chimpanzees can interbreed, various species of monkey can interbreed and have fertile offspring. So for me, the Neanderthals were always potentially able to interbreed with modern humans. But in my view, until recently, my view was that there was maybe interbreeding 40, 50,000 years ago, but it was on such a small scale that all trace of it vanished in the intervening years. Well, we now know from the Neanderthal genome studies that that was not so, that we do have a bit of Neanderthal in us, you and I, and it's a small level, but it's a significant level. So does that mean Neanderthals are a different species, or does it mean we include them in Homo sapiens? Well, for me, they are still only a small part of our makeup now. Physically, they went extinct maybe 30,000 years ago. They had separate behaviour, they had separate environments, they evolved under different conditions to us. So I think it's useful to still keep them as a different species, even if we remember that doesn't necessarily mean there was no interbreeding. And these strange people called the Denisovans. Now, we only know about them because of DNA work that's gone on in this site of Denisova in Siberia. So this is a cave that's been known for a long time. There were some very fragmentary human fossils from there, a finger bone, a couple of teeth, a foot bone, and each of them has yielded significant DNA. And the surprise was that DNA was distinct. It wasn't clearly Neanderthal, it wasn't clearly modern human, it was something different. So Svante Pääbo and his colleagues dubbed these people the Denisovans. And so we've got this site in Siberia with Denisovans, and now we know not only Denisovans are there, but the foot bone from the site has been analysed and has Neanderthal DNA in it. So this site was probably occupied in quite a short period of time by the Denisovans, by Neanderthals coming up from further south, we assume, and subsequently by modern humans. So remarkable site with 3 different kinds of humans living there in close proximity in time and space. Now, the Denisovans are only then known from this one site genetically. The fossils are too incomplete to tell us really what these people are like, except they've got big teeth, that's all we know. There are lots of fossils from Asia, from China, from India, China in particular, that may represent these Denisovans. So we've known about these people in China for a long time who didn't look Neanderthal, didn't look modern human. Fossils like the ones from Dali, Jinushan, Mapa. these might well be denisovans, but unfortunately we don't have DNA from them at the moment, and we have to hope that the DNA work will move on, and eventually we can actually unite the denisovan DNA with more complete fossils and say physically what these people look like. But the big surprise was not only was there someone distinct in Siberia, maybe 50,000 years ago, but when whole genome scans were done with modern humans, it turned out that there was one group of living humans that were related to the denisovans, that had denisovan DNA in them, and these people are down in Australasia. They're in New Guinea and Australia. So that's also very unexpected. So the denisovans are only known from their DNA up in Siberia. Down in New Guinea and Australia, we've got denisovan DNA in living people. So the way to explain that at the moment is that modern humans were dispersing through southern Asia towards Australia and New Guinea, and in that region denisovans must also have been living. So they weren't just in Siberia, they were actually right across Eastern Asia, down into Southeast Asia. So down in Southeast Asia, there was another interbreeding event with these people who eventually were going to end up in New Guinea and Australia, and those people have got a double archaic dose, if you like. They've got a bit of Neanderthal DNA that their ancestors picked up maybe as they were in Western Asia and met some Neanderthals, and then going through Southeast Asia, they picked up some denisovan DNA, and that gets added to the mix. So we end up with a pretty complicated story of intermixing of these lineages, which were separate for a long time, but then when they overlapped, they have interchanged genes, there has been some interbreeding. And we don't know the circumstances of the interbreeding. We don't know if this was two groups that came together and just regarded each other as people and got together the way people do, or maybe, some modern humans were lacking mates and decided to grab some mates from a neighbouring group. So we don't know the circumstances. It can't have been that common a behaviour, or there'd be a lot more DNA from these people. And it can't even have been a common behaviour with the Neanderthals, because of course if modern humans came out of Africa and spread gradually across Europe, we would expect if there was continuing interbreeding with Neanderthals, then actually Europeans would have a lot more Neanderthal DNA than someone in China or someone in New Guinea. But the extraordinary thing is the level of DNA is about the same in a modern European and a modern Chinese and a modern New Guinean. So it's either an early event that happened in Southwest Asia as modern humans first came out, they met some Neanderthals, might be 25 Neanderthals and 1,000 modern humans, that would be enough. And then that DNA gets carried with those modern humans as they spread out from that area. Another possibility, which Curat and Escoffier have recently argued, is that low level of interbreeding between Neanderthals and moderns is actually due to the unsuccessful nature of most of the interbreeding events, and actually that level of interbreeding in separate events was a measure of how non-viable those interbreeding events generally were, which is why there isn't much Neanderthal DNA in these people. So certainly, I'm thinking a lot about species concepts, I'm thinking about the out of Africa model, and also looking back into Africa itself, because I think that the idea that modern humans originated in Africa, I think, is still a sound concept, both behaviourally and physically. We originated in Africa. But I've come around to thinking that it wasn't a simple origin. 20 years ago, I would have argued that the origin was maybe in one place, maybe in East Africa or in South Africa. There was a period of time just in one place when modern humans became modern. Perhaps forced by climate change, modern humans physically changed and changed behaviourally under a lot of stress to become modern humans, a punctuational event. Now I think it's not simple in that way. I think that we can see the kind of focus, the centre of evolution of modern humans in Africa, moving around from one place to another, driven by climate changes. So at times we see innovations and behavioural change and physical changes in North Africa, at other times we see them in East Africa, and other times we see them in South Africa. And there are parts of Africa where we have no record at all, and we have to bear that in mind too. Africa's a huge place. We've got no ancient fossils at all from Central Africa or West Africa, none at all. So I think we have to bear in mind that our picture is also limited in terms of the sites that we've got and the information we've got. So for me, the African origin is still an uncertain process. We don't know exactly when it happened. We don't know exactly where it happened. And I think it will be more complicated. Recent evidence suggests that when modern humans appeared, and we have modern human fossils from Ethiopia at 160,000 years and at Herto, and 195,000 years from Homo kibish. So these do look physically like a more robust version of people today. But I think we're also seeing that the archaic ancestors of those people didn't just disappear when they evolved into modern humans. They actually continued, in some parts of Africa, probably living alongside, in a sense, their descendants. And so the Broken Hill specimen, one of the most famous examples of Homo heidelbergensis, I'm spending time now trying to complete the dating of that material, which was found way back in 1921. So it's only now that we've got the techniques to actually find out how old that specimen is, and I think we may have surprises that it'll be younger than many of us think. And not only that, there seem to be archaic humans in Tanzania and Kenya that are lingering on after modern humans have appeared. And even a specimen that I published on just in the last few weeks with colleagues from Nigeria. It's the oldest fossil from Nigeria, from a site called Iwo Eleru. It's about 13,000 years old. And yet if you look at it, you would say that it's much more ancient. You'd say that it was more than 100,000 years old. So this reminds us that we have a very biased picture of African evolution. And it reminds us that there could be more primitive relics of human evolution hanging on not only outside of Africa, in the form of maybe the Neanderthals and the Denisovans and over in Flores, this strange thing, the Hobbit. But in Africa itself, archaic humans could have been hanging on in parts of Africa as well. And on some new genetic analyses, they're putting in DNA into modern humans as recently as 35,000 years ago. So even in Africa, the process is more complicated than we thought. In terms of modern humans, this clearly does mean that in a sense, some modern humans have got more archaic genes than others. That seems to be so. So it does lead us on to kind of ask again this question of, what is a modern human? And I think that some of the most fascinating research that's going to come up in the next year or two will be homing in on the DNA that we've acquired from Neanderthals. Some people have acquired from Denisovans. Some African people have acquired maybe from Homo heidelbergensis. We're going to look at that DNA and see, is it functional? Is it actually doing something in the bodies of those people? So is it affecting brains, physique, physiology, and so on? And that's going to be a huge focus of research for the next few years. Because on the one hand, looking at these genes will help to really tell us what makes a Neanderthal, what makes a modern human, what makes a Denisovan a Denisovan. But also, it will maybe suggest that, as people had argued in the past, there are very robust fossils in places like Australia early on in time, in the Pleistocene. And some people, multi-regionalists, have argued that those fossils actually were, in a sense, descended from archaic ancestors in the local region. So I think that isn't going to be true for those fossils. They're still modern humans, for me, those fossils. But it might mean that some of those robust features are a sign of that genetic heritage from Denisovans. So we need to look at these fossils and try and reevaluate them. And that will be true of fossils in Europe, which some people have claimed show mixed features between Neanderthals and modern humans. I've tended to play that down and say that these are fundamentally either Neanderthals or modern humans. But we do need to now look at them again and see if there really are clues about that. And yes, this fossil from Nigeria at 13,000 years old does show what you can call mixed modern human and archaic features. So I think this is giving us a clue that we do need to look again at these fossils, and the species boundary is broken down in a sense in places, and we can look at the DNA now and actually try and see what's producing some of these differences between modern human populations. Are they due purely to differentiation from an African ancestor, or are they due to the input of some of these archaic genes? Obviously, the new way of looking at out of Africa does mean we have to revisit the whole question of regionality, races, if you want to call that, of modern humans. And I think there's no doubt that the fundamental processes that produced modern humans were, first of all, we had the evolution of the shared features of modern humans in Africa. So there we're talking about the high rounded skull, the small brow ridge, the chin on the lower jaw, the lightly built skeleton. Those features pretty certainly evolved in Africa. But then later on, superimposed on them were the regional so-called racial features. So in that sense, those features are add-ons to the shared modern morphology. And there's not a lot of DNA involved in most of those features, we know that. So for example, eye colour is just one tiny bit of DNA. So it doesn't need a lot of DNA to produce the regional differentiation we see today. So I think it's true to say that those genes are small in the big picture. You know, we share far more DNA and genes across the world than the ones that indicate differences between populations. But of course some of them can be significant, there's no doubt about it. And this brings us on to the question of intelligence and IQ. And certainly as modern humans have spread in small numbers around the world, and then been subjected to natural selection, sexual selection, drift, founder effect, we will get the creation of these regional differences, and some of these could indeed be in the brain. There could be cognitive differences at some level between different human populations. I find it difficult to believe they can be at the level of some of the IQ scores that we see banded around between different groups. And what we know about Africa is that it seems to have been the place of origin for most of our modern human characteristics. So for me, this indicates that the African environment is something that in the past certainly has driven innovation and creativity. And Africa, of course, has more genetic variation than the rest of the world put together. So it would be very surprising to me if some of these IQ scores we see banded around for African populations, which are uniformly lower than the populations, say, in Europe or China, I'd be very surprised if those really reflect the situation in Africa, where you'd expect, if anything, there to be a very large amount of variation in physical features and genetic features, and this might include things like IQ. So, you know, I'm certainly keeping an open mind about the extent of differences that will be found. But obviously what's going to be interesting with some of the DNA studies is that if there are genes from Neanderthals in some of us, if there are genes from Denisovans in some of us, will any of those be concerned with the brain? And that's going to be a very interesting topic of inquiry, which we need to keep in mind. So I think, you know, that's how I feel about racial evolution, if you like, regionality. I think that Darwin was puzzled, of course, by the evolution of many of these features. And if we read The Descent of Man, his favoured view for the evolution of many of these regional racial features was that they were sexually selected, or we could say culturally selected. And I think, you know, he was probably right about some of those things, that we can see that skin colour clearly has a relationship with ultraviolet light, with getting a balance between having enough UV getting into your skin to produce vitamin D, but not too much of it that it will damage the skin cells and produce skin cancers, or will destroy folic acid, which of course will then affect pregnant women. So there's a balancing act in skin colour, and I think there's no doubt natural selection's at work there. But when we look at other features, such as, say, oriental eyes, or you know, the shape of the kind of hair we've got, maybe Darwin was right that sexual selection is at work there. And as populations spread out in small numbers, cultural preferences for attractiveness might have driven some of these differences. And again, not much DNA involved, but producing quite striking differences between these populations. So I think one of the most remarkable advances we've seen in the time that I've been researching, which is sort of 40 odd years now in human evolution, when I began my PhD in 1970 and went on my PhD research trip in 1971, the technology was very primitive. Basically, I went around Europe with a suitcase with measuring instruments, calipers, tapes, protractors. I applied these to the fossil skulls of Neanderthals and modern humans that I was studying around Europe, spent 4 months doing that. Took half a day to study a single skull and collect that data. It was all, you know, put down by hand on a data sheet. There were not even any photocopying machines around. So, you know, I could have lost all my data quite easily if I didn't realise how precious it was to me. So I should have found some way of backing that up, but there were no pocket calculators, there were no photocopy machines. So it was entirely non-digital. So I got back to Bristol, and the computer in Bristol, the mainframe computer for the whole of the university, was probably about 4 times the size of this room, but with less processing power than my watch here and now. So I laboriously had to transcribe all those measurements by hand onto punch cards. The punch cards went into the computer. A day later, I would come back and get the results of that particular analysis, or if it didn't work, I'd have to put them all in again, which often happened. So things were laboriously slow. It took me 4 months on that trip to gather all that data. It took me another 1.5 years to analyse that data to get into my PhD results. Well, the fact is now, of course, that with the advent of CT scanning and digital technology, that a good student sitting at a computer console here or in Zurich or in Leipzig or in the States could conjure up an equivalent amount of data that I gathered, in fact more data than I gathered, on a series of skulls in a few days, and they could do all the computational analyses of that data in a few weeks. So what took me effectively 4 years could be accomplished by a good student now in a few weeks. So there's those tremendous advances, and of course CT technology gives you access to far more data. So I was limited to the measuring points on my skulls that I could put my measuring instruments on. You can capture the whole shape of a specimen, of course, through scanning. You can look at the internal morphology, the inner ear bones of Neanderthals, which we now know are differently shaped from modern human ones. And we only learnt that through CT technology. So all of that's made a huge difference to what we can get out of our fossils. So in a sense, I'm jealous of the new generation that can come in and do all this in such a short period of time. On the other hand, by going around Europe for 4 months, I actually held the Neanderthal skull in my hands, and the Cro-Magnon skull, and all of these wonderful relics that it was just wonderful to have a hands-on approach, and I do think that it was valuable to see all that material. And so in a sense, the people doing the digital stuff on their consoles are missing that kind of emotional contact, I suppose, with the fossils which I had. When I began my work in 1970, the field, I think it's fair to say, was kind of dominated by people who believed in evolutionary continuity of Neanderthals and modern humans. So we have people like Loring Brace, very influential, then at Michigan, still at Michigan. And Loring firmly believed that the Neanderthals, or a Neanderthal stage in evolution, occurred all over the world. So everywhere we looked in the Middle Pleistocene, there were people like Neanderthals, and they were the ancestors for the modern people in each region. And if we had a complete fossil record, we would see a gradual transition in each region through Neanderthals or Neanderthal-like forms to modern humans. And that view was, I think, the dominant view probably around 1970. And Milford Warpoff was one of Loring Brace's students, and he certainly came out of that tradition and developed his own version, if you like, by going back to Franz Weidenreich's views. So Franz Weidenreich, the German anatomist, had developed a theory which is now known as multi-regional evolution, and Milford Warpoff and Alan Thorne and Wu Jingzi in 1984 published a paper which really laid out multi-regional evolution. So this argued that Homo erectus, when it spread out around the old world, started then to evolve towards modern humans in each part of the world. But these lines didn't diverge, they actually were glued together by gene flow. So these populations were breeding with each other across the whole range of humans at the time, and so there was no single place where modern humans evolved. Basically, modern humans evolved everywhere where ancient humans lived. And more or less every fossil potentially could be placed in these lineages leading through to modern humans. So that was another view which came through strongly in the 1980s. There were people who weren't part of that framework. So Bill Howes, for example, William Howes, Harvard, who certainly I spent a lot of time with in the 1970s talking about the origins of modern humans. And Bill was someone who really didn't think the Neanderthals were our ancestors. And he certainly was a big influence on me and my thinking. And we didn't know in the 1970s where modern humans had evolved, but both of us felt it wasn't from the Neanderthals. But we weren't sure, if not from the Neanderthals, where those ancestors were. Were they in the Far East? Were they in Africa? In the 1970s, we couldn't say. But then during the 1980s, the data started to build up that the African record was significant, that archaeologically, Africa wasn't a backward place, and physically even, Africa wasn't a backward place, that modern humans were there as early as anywhere else in the world, and then gradually the data grew to show that actually modern humans were there earlier in Africa than they were anywhere else. So this was the beginning in the 1980s of what we call out of Africa now, recent African origin. So Bill Howes was a pioneer of that view in the sense of saying that there was a single centre for modern human origins, but he couldn't say where it was, but he felt that most likely, given the similarities among humans all over the world, physically and genetically, most likely there was a centre of origin. Later on, of course, he took up strongly the African origin model. Desmond Clarke, on the archaeological side, was also very strong in that view. And of course, Desmond also had links with Tim White. So Tim White, of course, is someone who actually goes out in the field and finds fossils. I haven't been lucky enough to do that on the excavations I've been. We've tended to find lots of archaeology and lots of fauna, but I haven't been lucky with fossils. But Tim, of course, has been out to sites for many years, puts in a huge amount of time into that field work to actually find the fossils. And in that sense, he's linked in with people like Don Johansson and Richard Leakey, who, of course, have been great at actually getting the funding and going out and having expeditions. So I tend to look at the results of all that field work that other people are doing. Clark Howell was another big influence on me, and Clark was someone who did also go out into the field, but he wasn't blessed with good luck, so he didn't find the fantastically complete fossils which other people found on their expeditions. But he was someone who also thought hard about the Neanderthals and their place in evolution, and he was someone who was really meticulous in the anatomical details that he looked at in fossils. So he taught me a lot about how to look at the morphology of fossils. And so we come into the more recent stages, and obviously we get the development of the increase in computing power. We get the beginning of the impact of DNA work. So 1987, a real watershed time really, with the publication in Nature of that mitochondrial Eve paper by Can, Stoneking and Wilson. So a few of us had been kind of advocating a recent African origin among humans before then, but it wasn't until 87 that suddenly this whole story was on the front pages of journals and newspapers. It suddenly became very sexy. Modern human origins was suddenly a topic that people were talking about. More money became available for research and for fieldwork on recent human evolution. Before that, it has to be said that the sexy areas were the origins in Africa. So people were looking in the Rift Valley in South Africa. That's where the money was being poured into. But after 1987, people started to pick up on the evolution of modern humans as a significant topic, and we started to get more conferences, more field work, more public interest in our own evolution, which of course I was delighted to ride on that wave of increasing public interest in modern human origins. Until 2004, we thought that only modern humans had got across the Wallace line. Now the Wallace line, of course, is a line that was created by the zoologist Alfred Russel Wallace, and this line demarcated a big change in the fauna and flora in Southeast Asia as we move from places like Java across into the islands that are leading to New Guinea and Australia. So the view was that ancient humans like Homo erectus got as far as Java, but they didn't get any further. And only modern humans with boats were able to get onto those islands leading across to New Guinea and Australia. So that was the view up to 2004. But then this weird find came out of the Liangbua cave on Flores. Homo floresiensis, it's been called, nicknamed the Hobbit, because of course the Lord of the Rings films were popular at that time. And the excavators who described this material in Nature argued that they had found a new species of human, a very primitive species, small-bodied, about a metre tall, primitive features in the skeleton, and a brain the size of a chimpanzee's brain. And this creature was living on the island of Flores, way across the Wallace line, 500 kilometres beyond Java. And not only that, it was still around 17,000 years ago. So it was around after the Neanderthals had died out, still hanging on in this island of Flores. So it was an extraordinary plane really, from a partial skeleton and some more fragmentary material dug just from this one site on Flores. So I was actually at the press conference where these finds were announced and commentated on it, and I was impressed by the evidence. I was certainly someone who took this seriously as a distinct human-like species that had somehow got to Flores and had evolved separately in isolation for a long period of time. So the mainstream view in 2004 was that this creature was perhaps a dwarf form of Homo erectus. So Homo erectus had somehow headed eastwards, arrived on Flores, and on the conditions of this relatively small island, the species had dwarfed down in size, which is a process we know happens to medium to large sized mammals, a process called insular dwarfism, where animals may shrink down on an island with reduced resources. Evolution favours a reduced body size. So the argument was this was a dwarfed Homo erectus, which explained the smaller body size and the smaller brain size. However, some researchers refused to accept that. They felt that this was such a bizarre find under bizarre circumstances, and they've actually favoured the view that this is some kind of pathological modern human. Maybe suffering from cretinism or microcephaly, something called Laron syndrome. So these conditions can produce small brains and small bodies in modern humans. So some people have argued these finds are simply modern humans suffering from some kind of disease process, and they're not a distinct species at all. So that view is a minority view, but it's continued to come up. New syndromes have been produced that attempt to claim, to produce the morphology we see. But I'm not convinced by it. We've got now, I think, over 100 fossils from Liangbua, not just that one skeleton. There are a number of other individuals. There's a second jawbone, which to me looks every bit as primitive, archaic as the first jawbone that's with the skeleton. And these finds are found in levels from about 17,000 right down to about 90,000 years in the cave. And there's archaeology right through those levels. So for me, it remains a convincing, distinct form of human, and one that may be even more primitive than was originally considered. Because recent research on the material, more detailed research, has found a number of features we actually seem to be more primitive even than ones we find in Homo erectus. So the suggestion is now that this might represent an even earlier stage of human evolution, one that's closer to Homo habilis or even to Australopithecus, these creatures that lived 2 million years or more in Africa. The argument is that one of those forms got out of Africa, and we've got no evidence of that happening, but that one of these forms got out of Africa more than 2 million years ago, somehow found its way all the way over to Southeast Asia, survived in isolation on the island of Flores until 17,000 years ago when it went extinct. So that would be an even more extraordinary story than a Homo erectus getting there and dwarfing, that you've actually got a relic of an earlier stage of human evolution that got all the way over there. So lots of questions arise from this very challenging find for all of us really in explaining where it came from and what happened to it. So, did it die out because of the impact of modern humans, which is an argument that's been used for the extinction of Neanderthals? Well, according to the excavators on Flores, there's no evidence of modern humans 17,000 years ago. The modern humans come later. But there is evidence of a massive volcanic eruption at about 17,000 years ago, which produced very thick ash in Liangbua Cave and elsewhere on the island. And so it may well be that this eruption was so enormous that it devastated the vegetation on the island and led to the extinction of the hobbit, which would be a very sad end if it really was a 2 million year evolutionary history over on this area to then be brought to an end by something like a volcanic eruption. And where it came from, well, that's still a mystery. On the one hand, was it from Homo erectus? Well, Mike Morwood has certainly argued that more likely the ancestors of the hobbits were coming from the north, because the currents of water in that region actually run from Sulawesi southwards down to places like Timor and then westwards. So that's the opposite direction from a transit from Java. So if you're in Java, you've got to go eastwards to get to Flores. Morwood argues that actually the hobbits' ancestors will be found further north, and remarkably he and colleagues have found stone tools on Flores which are 1 million years old, which might be stone tools made by the ancestral form of the hobbit, And he's even found apparently tools on the island of Sulawesi, which are 1 million years old. That also is over the Wallace Line, the island of Sulawesi, further north. So we've got a whole unknown history there for the Hobbit. Just as we've got almost an unknown history for the Denisovans in Siberia, we've got these strange creatures on the island of Flores where we have a huge amount to learn about their evolutionary history. I think one of the most fantastic recent finds is the material from South Africa, from the site of Malapa. So this is material that's just been found in the last few years, and we've seen a series of papers published in Science in the last few months. And this is a species of Australopithecus called Australopithecus sediba. And it's clearly related to the existing species Australopithecus africanus. So the tongue specimen, the famous tongue specimen, Mrs. Ples, these are examples of Australopithecus africanus that lived in South Africa more than 2 million years ago. And I think it's true to say that for most people, the South African Australopithecines have been kind of sidelined out of the mainstream of human evolution. So the mainstream view has been that East Africa has been where human evolution happened, the beginning of humans, Homo habilis and so on, coming out of maybe something like Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis. So the view has been East Africa is where humans evolved. And we get this species Homo erectus about 1.8 million years ago in East Africa with a local evolutionary history. Well, the odd thing is that sediba is close to 2 million years old, and it has many more human features than Australopithecus africanus. So we've got this strange thing of a fossil down in South Africa that looks a lot like Australopithecus africanus, but added on to that rather, non-human anatomy, if you like. You've got human features in the teeth, in the pelvis, in the legs, in the hands. So this suggests that, for some people, that actually the transition to Homo occurred in South Africa and not East Africa, and you can now sideline all those East African things and concentrate on South Africa. So that's one view. I tend to actually the view that it's not going to be a simple process, that basically if there were Australopithecines, as we know, were living in Ethiopia, in Kenya, in Tanzania, and Malawi, down in South Africa. So these different species of Australopithecus were actually widespread over the whole of East Africa. And then if in a number of areas we get parallel change, that they start to use tools to an increasing extent, they start to eat meat to an increasing extent, they start to travel longer distances to get their food on two legs, this will drive parallel human-like changes in the body, the hands, the brain even. And that maybe is what we're seeing both in East Africa and in South Africa. So which of these areas really will be the place of origin of the genus Homo, I think is still an open question. But sediba reminds us that South Africa could be part of that story, and that Australopithecus africanus didn't just die out. It carried on evolving seemingly, and it even started to evolve some human-like features. So this material is important in evolutionary terms, but also important because of the completeness of the material. So far published are two fairly complete skeletons of a boy, probably, maybe 9 or 10 when he died, and an adult female. Still unpublished, we believe, are 3 more individuals, all from this one site. And it looks like these individuals fell one after another into a death trap. And they fell into anoxic water, where there was very slow decay of the tissues, and so you've got potentially virtually complete bodies there, and even the possibility, according to Lee Berger, of soft tissue preservation. So between the sediment around them, attached to them, glued onto them, and the bone, there seems to be layers in places that look like they could be layers of skin that might have preservation of soft tissue, of hair, things like that. So even more extraordinary if that's true. But just for their completeness, these are really important. Yeah, I think that the impact of genetic work on our field is enormous. There's no doubt. So when you think back, 1997, tiny bit of mitochondrial DNA was found from the Neanderthal fossil in Germany. And again, I was at a press conference where Svante Parbo announced that first bit of tiny DNA, and I think I got carried away and said it was like landing a man on Mars, which was a little bit beyond the truth. But it was a tremendous achievement, it seemed at the time. But no one could have believed that, 10 years later, we'd be talking about most of a genome of a Neanderthal coming out. So the technical advances have been enormous. The ability to recover the DNA, massive computing power, huge databases of comparative DNA sampling have allowed us now to complete most of the genome of a Neanderthal, in fact several Neanderthals, and also recover this DNA of these people called the Denisovans. So I think wherever there are cold conditions, we will have good DNA preservation. So in Asia and Europe, in the north, we are going to get more DNA. And we will have DNA from, of course, modern human fossils as well, which has been slow to come through because of the problems of contamination. Because obviously Cro-Magnon DNA that's 35,000 years old in Europe is going to be very close to modern European DNA in many respects. So there have been lingering problems of contamination, but those are being overcome. So I think we are going to see the growth of increase, at least in the cooler environments, of our DNA knowledge of early humans, modern humans, and archaic humans. We may find there are other people than the Denisovans and the Neanderthals to be found in these regions. So there will be more surprises to come. We will get a look at the functional DNA of these individuals. So, for the first time, we can make a comparison, not just the chimp genome and the modern human genome, we can add in the Neanderthal genome and the Denisovan genome. And so we can start to see what unites those three human genomes compared with the chimpanzee. So what evolved along the human line to make us human. And then individually, what made the Neanderthals what they were, what made the Denisovans what they were, and what makes us what we are. So this will even impact, of course, on our own nature, what makes a modern human a modern human. And already a number of bits of DNA have been identified that are distinct in modern humans, where the Neanderthals are like chimpanzees. So some of these are concerned with the brain, some are concerned with the skin and physiology, some are concerned with how the skeleton grows, and some are concerned even with things like the motility of sperm. So these things now people are homing in on, and we really are going to be able to tell in the next few years a lot about what makes a Neanderthal, what makes a Denisovan, and what makes... So here's my sort of simple representation of human evolution over the last 2 million years, my current thinking. We've got here the lineage of the hobbit, Homo floresiensis, diverging maybe more than 2 million years ago, and heading up in isolation in Southeast Asia, going extinct about 17,000 years ago. We've got Homo erectus, maybe most likely originating in Africa, giving rise to lineages which continue in the Far East, in China and Java, but which go extinct. In Europe, perhaps giving rise to this species Homo antecessor, pioneer man, known from site in Spain, again going extinct. And in the western part of the Old World, we get the development of this new species, Homo heidelbergensis, present in Europe and Africa. And heidelbergensis, we knew had gone two ways, to modern humans and the Neanderthals, but we now know, because of the Denisovans, that actually heidelbergensis went three ways. So north of the Mediterranean, it gave rise to the Neanderthals. Over in the Far East, it gave rise to the Denisovans. There's evidence that even heidelbergensis genes carried on in Africa for a period of time, but modern humans evolved in Africa and then spread out from Africa to the rest of the world. But in doing so, we now know that the Neanderthals and the Denisovans genetically did not go distinct. They went physically extinct, but their genes were input into modern humans, perhaps in Western Asia, and then a smaller group of modern humans picked up DNA from these Denisovans. So we end up with quite a complicated story, and even some of this ancient DNA coming back into modern humans within Africa. So mostly out of Africa, but with some of these additional complications. They separated maybe 400,000 years ago from our lineage. So they're in that position of being either a part of Homo sapiens, but a very different part to anyone alive today, or, as I prefer to argue, they're a separate species, a separate evolutionary history. But I've never actually argued that that meant they were reproductively isolated from us, because we know that many closely related species, in primates for example, bonobos and common chimpanzees can interbreed, various species of monkey can interbreed and have fertile offspring. So for me, the Neanderthals were always potentially able to interbreed with modern humans. But in my view, until recently, my view was that there was maybe interbreeding 40, 50,000 years ago, but it was on such a small scale that all trace of it vanished in the intervening years. Well, we now know from there were some very fragmentary human fossils from there, a finger bone, a couple of teeth, a foot bone, and each of them has yielded significant DNA. And the surprise was that DNA was distinct. It wasn't clearly Neanderthal, it wasn't clearly modern human, it was something different. So Svante Pääbo and his colleagues dubbed these people the Denisovans. And so we've got this site in Siberia with Denisovans, and now we know not only Denisovans are there, but the foot bone from the site has been analysed and has Neanderthal DNA in it. So this site was probably occupied in quite a short period of time by the Denisovans, by Neanderthals coming up from further south, we assume, and subsequently by modern humans. So remarkable site with 3 different kinds of humans living their Neanderthal genome studies. That was not so, that we do have a bit of Neanderthal in us, you and I, and it's a small level, but it's a significant level. So does that mean Neanderthals are a different species, or does it mean we include them in Homo sapiens? Well, for me, they are still only a small part of our makeup now. Physically, they went extinct maybe 30,000 years ago. They had separate behaviour, they had separate environments, they evolved under different conditions to us. So I think it's useful to still keep them as a different species, even if we remember that doesn't necessarily mean there was no interbreeding. And these strange people called the Denisovans, now we only know about them because of DNA work that's gone on in this site of Denisova in Siberia. So this is a cave that's been known for a long time, they're called species. So we're having to come and look out of Africa again, and also even look at the species concepts we've got, because if these species are interbreeding with each other, are they really distinct species? So we've got to look again at the species question. And for me, we can show clearly that the Neanderthals were a distinct lineage. They had their own separate evolutionary history. So we're having to re-evaluate the out of Africa theory, and we're going to have to re-evaluate our species concepts, because on one view of thinking, species are self-contained units, they don't interbreed with other species. And for me, the whole idea of Neanderthals as a different species is really a recognition of their separate evolutionary history. The fact that we can show that they evolved through time in a particular direction, distinct from modern humans. And well, at the moment, I'm certainly looking again at the whole question of a recent African origin for modern humans, because that's been the leading idea of the last 20 years, that we had a recent African origin, that we came out of Africa and we replaced all these other humans that were outside of Africa. And we're having to reevaluate that now, because genetic data show that the modern humans who came out of Africa maybe 60,000 years ago actually interbred with Neanderthals, first of all, and then some of them later on interbred with another group of people called the Denisovans over in Eastern Asia. So we are not purely a recent African origin. We're mostly recent African origin, but there was contact with these other